And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program in the southern Indian city of Chennai, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi welcomed the Chinese President Xi Jinping. The two leaders' informal summit follows their first in the central Chinese city of Wuhan last April. China and India account for about 37% of the global population. What can we expect from these two huge developing economies? Before we get down to a discussion about the latest development, take a look at Chinese President Xi's trip so far.
It's Chinese President Xi Jinping's first overseas trip after the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. In India's southern city, Chennai, President Xi is scheduled to go one-on-one with Prime Minister Modi on issues that have overall, long-term and strategic significance to bilateral relations. The trip aims to open up new space for strengthening regional connectivity and economic and trade cooperation, set up new platforms to build mutual trust and friendship among regional populations, and make new contributions to world peace and prosperity. Xi and Modi held their first informal meeting last April in central China's Wuhan city. During the visit, the two leaders had a frank exchange of views. They reached broad consensus on China-India relations and major international issues of mutual concern. China has long been India's largest trading partner, and India is China's largest trading partner in South Asia. Since the beginning of the 21st century, the two-way trade has grown from less than $3 billion to nearly $100 billion. Indian films have been gaining more box office success in China, giving Chinese audiences a window into daily lives in India. The Chinese president will visit India for 2 days before he pays a state visit to Nepal that runs through Sunday.
For more discussion on Chinese President Xi Jinping's important visit in India and Nepal, joining us from New Delhi, we have Sitrapu Uday Bhaskar, who is the director of the Society for Policy Studies, also a retired commandor of the Indian Navy. Welcome, sir. He is one of India's leading experts and outspoken critics on security and strategic affairs. I guess that's the title that he prefers. And also in our Beijing studio, Liu Youfa, a former Chinese Consul General in Mumbai. I want to welcome both of you. Mr. Liu, you just came back from a trip to India. If you could look at the camera right in front of you, sir. So would you help us to understand what do you think might be achieved during this 24-hour interaction the Chinese president would have in India?
Well, I think this current informal meeting between the two leaders of the countries was the second one in a session. During the Wuhan summit, they broadly reached the consensus. This time, they have focused apparently on quite a few key issues which are concerning the key interest of both sides. From the news we get, on top of the agenda from the Indian side, it is the trade imbalance, and followed by the border issues. Of course, the latest, conflict between Pakistan and India vis-a-vis Kashmir is an issue, and both leaders are exchanging views on multilateral issues.
I see.
Yeah.
Mr. Bhaskar, putting diplomatic rhetorics aside, what do you think can be achieved by the 24 hours?
I think what can be achieved, madam, is a higher level of understanding between the two leaders. I think it is very significant that President Xi Jinping is coming to India as the first overseas visit after the 70th anniversary celebrations of China. So I think there is political symbolism. Yes, as my Chinese colleague has pointed out, there are areas where there is a divergence, almost leading to discord. It is the territorial dispute, it is Kashmir, it is Pakistan, and so on. But I think Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping bring a very high degree of political maturity to the table to say that yes, we have problems that we need to address, but can we identify areas where we can cooperate? And I think that is the spirit, that though it appears like only 24 hours, I am told the two leaders will have almost 5 to 6 hours to be able to speak to each other in a candid and constructive way. I mean, China is an elder brother.
Let's take a look at some.
India has a long history with China.
Yes, indeed. Let's take a look at some of the specific issues rather than talking diplomatically. One of the things is what actually could bring these two together. That's probably even more important than just some of the issues we outlined over there. In other words, what do the two have in common to make the two believe and their countries firm about the thought that cooperation between the two is necessarily going to be much more beneficial than any kinds of disagreements between the two? Mr. Liu, your thought?
From my personal perspective, both India and China are at the crossroad in terms of the economic sustainability. And secondly, both are having responsibilities as the major countries at the international arena. And thirdly, both have the responsibility to realize the national goals. From my recent trip to India, the feeling I get is India is very much, bending backward in realizing the global strategy to be a global power. So I think in this sense, as two major global powers, China and India have to work together, hand in hand, rather than face to face.
Well, you could also argue China and the United States are also global powers, but at this moment they are not necessarily working together hand in hand. So, Mr. Bhaskar, what do you think strategically can bring China and India closer? I mean, putting aside some of the earlier specific issues, whether it's Kashmir or trade, but what would bring these two actually together on some common visions, Mr. Bhaskar?
I would say, madam, in one word, it is the political kind of determination on both sides to look at the big picture, meaning that President Xi Jinping has determined that China should become the most developed country in the world by 2049. Prime Minister Modi has a vision for India, that India should also move up the socio-economic ladder. Both countries are committed to the Asian century. And I've said this on your show in the past, I'm saying it again.
Indeed.
If we have to have an Asian century, China and India must work in harmony. And if President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi can agree that we will disagree on some issues, territory, Pakistan, terrorism and so on, but we will cooperate on the other areas, and as my Chinese colleague pointed out, the economic dimension for China and India, we are at the crossroads. If China takes a long-term decision and says, we need to engage with a country that has 1.2 billion people and it has a GDP of $3 trillion, to use a phrase of macroeconomy, the catch-up area for India to move from 3 trillion to 10 trillion to 15 trillion will help China to go up from 14 to 20 to 25.
Well, we all have arguments.
The Asian century can be realized.
Yeah, we all have arguments from our own perspective, but the question really is, what is the common ground that both sides can build? Not just another way of persuading the other of your own agenda. One of the things is about trade in the region. You said it very well, Mr. Bhaskar. What about the Asia-Pacific region? Asia, if you look at it, RCEP, the Regional Economic Partnership, of course, that's something that's been in discussion. Besides the ASEAN countries, there are also China, India, Australia, New Zealand, some of the regional powers are joining in. So what would the potential of all of these latest discussions and negotiations mean about a common vision that we have? Mr. Liu.
The greatest prospect I can imagine is the largest trade market, which takes up about 40% of the global population. No other market can be even that close. Secondly, it will be providing a space for the infrastructure networks which help to bring the individual national markets into a single market. We talk about the Asia century, but that's a initial stage. So thirdly, it will be for major economies like India and China to display their comparative advantages, their industries, so that other countries can pull together their advantages. So when all these things are working together, we can really create the scenario to realize the Asia century in the 21st century.
Mr. Bhaskar, I mean, just to be frank, everybody understands this, whether we say it or not. There are vulnerabilities of countries, whether it's China or India. For example, the trade war going on between China and the United States, for example, territorial disputes going on between India and Pakistan. Every country has vulnerability of one kind or the other. The question really is how to address these vulnerabilities by having a bigger vision. I guess that is the fundamental question to be asked. Your take, Mr. Bhaskar.
But I think you're absolutely right, madam, that every country has its own vulnerabilities and, may I add, sensitivities.
That's right.
Yeah.
I would say, as an Indian analyst, that New Delhi is very, very conscious of China's sensitivities. If we can speak frankly and candidly on your show, may I say that at this point in time, when China is facing with a number of these sensitive issues, vulnerable issues, whether it is the trade war with the United States, or for instance what is happening in Hong Kong, or for instance China's current attempt at having training camps for those who are in Uyghur Muslims of China, India has maintained what I would call as the appropriate protocol. India understands that these are sensitive issues for China. These have not been discussed in any manner that would be deemed to be inappropriate by China.
I see.
So what India expects is that China would also have the same empathy for India's core concerns. Prime Minister Modi talks about terrorism repeatedly. We had an attack in our city in Mumbai in 2008. India is saying that let us have a candid discussion so that we can deal with this problem effectively. So my short answer to your question is empathy.
Okay.
Both sides should have empathy for the other's vulnerability and sensitivity.
Let's leave for some other time, but also for the Chinese guests to respond in this because we need to have equal share of time. Mr. Liu, what about the so-called sensitivity areas? What about the core concerns? And what about when it is also in a way related to the other issues that has been there? For example, China wants to keep a well-balanced between its relationship with India and also its long-time partnership with Pakistan. So how to address this question with a delicate balance is the key here, Mr. Liu.
With regard to the Sino-Pakistan relations,
in terms of how do you think the Chinese president and the Chinese delegation there would like to handle this, what would you say?
Two principles here. That is, to be the peacemaker between India and Pakistan. And secondly, to protect the sovereign rights of China. China is sensitive to the Indian sensitivities on quite a few issues. And I am quite sure President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi will seriously discuss the trilateral relations among India, Pakistan, and China. I am sure President Xi Jinping will make it very clear China has a stake in South Asia. China has a stake in in Pakistan. China is also having a stake in India. So the
other way around as well.
It is. So the sensibility to one another among three countries are the key to maintain the peace along the South Asia continent, and also to promote the peace and stability of the region.
Okay. Mr. Bhaskar, there's one thing very important. That is, what kind of region and what kind of world that China and India, as the largest developing countries, want to have for their own futures and also for the future of many who are in the developing world. So that probably is one of the most important common ground India, China have right now. When others, for example, wants to have so-called Indo-Pacific strategy for their own interest, these two countries have to realize as to what their national interests are and do accordingly to their national interests and to the regional interests, because eventually it's the future that they have to face. So on that part, Mr. Bhaskar, what is the rationale, do you think, thinking process and rationale now coming from New Delhi?
I would say that for both countries, both for China and for India, the top priority for any political leader, in this case Mr. Xi Jinping in China and Mr. Modi in India, is to improve the socio-economic conditions of their citizens.
That's right.
China has done a remarkable job in removing poverty. I think the way in which over the last 30-40 years, ever since you had the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, China has done a remarkable job in what is called in development studies as poverty alleviation. India has made some progress, but we still have a large demography that has to move up, and Prime Minister Modi in his second term has identified this as his top priority. But if that has to happen, I repeat this point, India's current economic growth rate, which is about 5.8 to 6%, has to go back to 8% or even more. And the only way that can happen is if there is stability in India, in South Asia, and China can play what I would call as an empathetic and positive role, so that more people, not just in India, Pakistan, I'm so glad that Mr. Liu, our Chinese colleague, said China has a stake in Pakistan. We welcome that if China can help the socio-economic development of Pakistan and other parts of South Asia where there is a poverty issue.
I see.
So I think if Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi Jinping can agree on this as their topmost priority, a lot of things would fall into place, and that is where I think the informal summit provides perhaps the most appropriate forum for the two leaders to exchange their views.
You said it very clearly, sir. Mr. Liu, also your time to respond to your Indian colleague, and how is China looking at this potential of the region? Because after all, these developing countries are growing, and the future could be theirs together with their partners around the world. So how China and India, particularly the leaders who are very charismatic in their own ways, be able to see that and work on some of the delicate issues?
It's so coincidental. I just took a trip to Indonesia, where the ASEAN centrality strategy vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific pivotal proposed by the U.S.
I see. Interesting. Tell us
and
more
I
about
also went
that.
to India.
Okay.
The focal message I got from all the parties, I talked to more than 100 scholars and retired military generals and professors. The common sense is, from the ASEAN side, Indo-Pacific pivoting by the U.S. is targeting China, specifically on the military side. But for ASEAN perspectives, it's their focal idea to take off the military encroachment on China. They accepted the Indo-Pacific strategy based on the economic and security cooperation.
I see.
I am glad I took the message from the Indian, scholars and retired generals and politicians, retired ambassadors, that India was also supporting the centrality of ASEAN in this area.
Was also or is also supporting?
Is also, has been
there we
supporting
go.
very clearly. And their wish was President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi would be using this second informal summit to reach the consensus on how to take stock from the joint efforts to take ASEAN as the central player, so that to make sure that the regional peace, stability, and the cooperation would be maintained as a platform for all the countries to take stock from.
Before we go, both of you gentlemen, you've been helping us to understand the thinking process and the rationale, the logic behind this meeting, which is the most important thing. And before we go, I do want to invite your wisdom as well. You know, there are so many things going on, even within one day, 24 hours as we speak. There are negotiations, there are meetings, there are all kinds of multilateral approaches. So what would this meeting mean for these two countries and the others who pay very close attention to what's going on right now when the two presidents are meeting with one another? I mean, the Chinese president are meeting with the Indian Prime Minister. Mr. Bhaskar, you want to go first?
Well, I would say, madam, from the Indian perspective, I think Prime Minister Modi, to my mind, would emphasize his own vision, which is also related to the maritime domain, where he has used a word called Sagar, S-A-G-A-R. The word Sagar in Sanskrit means ocean, and the acronym in English is security and growth for all in the region. He said this in his speech in Shangri-La last year, that India's engagement with the Indo-Pacific is not directed against any country. India wants it to be ASEAN-led. My sense is he would say the same thing, that whatever we do should be as a policy that would ensure security and growth for all in the region. That, I think, is the Modi vision, which I'm sure he'll share with President Xi Jinping.
What's likely to be the message, Mr. Liu, that the two can deliver together that would make all the other players in the region, and probably even beyond, know what they have in front of them?
What I want to say briefly is the 21st century is the century of Asia. For that matter, China and India have to display their historical responsibilities by working together, because the Asian century will not become a reality unless the two countries are joining hands.
Okay.
We have disputes and differences, but the common mission is to seek for the cooperation for the common development.
I can see both of you are very passionate for this round of discussion. Obviously, there are a lot at stake in this very important interaction between the Chinese President Xi Jinping and, of course, the Indian Prime Minister Modi. Thank you so much, the two of you, for joining us. Bhaskar and Liu Youfa. Really appreciate it. Thank you.